Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in North America, and the place where the story of the United States is usually said to begin. In 2012, archaeologists emptying a cellar inside the fort walls found human remains lying among butchered animal bone, a skull in more than a dozen pieces, and a shin bone, both cut with metal tools. The Smithsonian examined them and reported what the marks meant. These were the remains of a 14-year-old English girl butchered for meat during the winter of 1609. For 400 years that had been called a lie, and the company that owned Virginia printed a document specifically to call it a lie. It worked. It held for 4 centuries, which opens a far bigger problem than one bad winter, because if the founding record of America was edited by the people who profited from America, then the question is not whether this happened. The question is what else is in that record. Understand what is actually at stake, because it is not the cannibalism. Almost everything known about the first years of the United States comes from a small number of written accounts produced at the time by a handful of men. Those accounts are the foundation. Every textbook chapter about Jamestown sits on top of them. But Jamestown was not a country, it was a business. The colony was owned and run by the Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company. It ran on investors and it ran on recruitment. It needed English families to keep boarding ships. So the first chapter of American history was not written by neutral witnesses. It was written and shaped by an organization that needed the story to sell. That is a claim people have made before. What was missing was physical proof. A cellar in Virginia produced it. Start with the written record, because that is where this was buried. 4 separate accounts from the period describe cannibalism during the winter of 1609 to 1610 at Jamestown, the winter the colonists themselves called the starving time. George Percy, the man serving as president that winter, wrote the most graphic of them. He describes a colonist who killed his wife and salted her body for food. A General Assembly report from 1624 repeats it and adds detail. The man fed on her until he had devoured everything except her head. Captain John Smith mentions it. Sir Thomas Gates mentions it. So the accounts exist, and historians still would not accept them for 4 centuries. Here is why, and it is a fair reason. Every one of those men had a motive. Percy was defending his own record as the president who presided over a catastrophe. Others were arguing over who had ruined the colony and who had saved it. Accusations of cannibalism were a weapon in that fight. And there was a second problem, which is the one that matters here. Consider what news of cannibalism does to a company selling passage to Virginia. In December of 1610, the Virginia Company published a tract. Its title tells you exactly what it was for. A declaration of the estate of the colony in Virginia, with a confutation of such scandalous reports as have tended to the disgrace of so worthy an enterprise. A confutation of scandalous reports. Sir Thomas Gates wrote the first published account of that winter, and he denied that things had ever got as bad as the rumors claimed. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a printed document. You can read it. The organization that owned Virginia identified the story, named it slander, and published against it. And it worked. It worked for 400 years. Which brings us to the one thing a company cannot edit. The cellar itself is worth understanding, because it records the winter in order. It was full of butchered animal bone. Horses first, then dogs, then progressively smaller animals, all of it cut and cracked open for marrow. The written accounts add that eventually they boiled leather from their own shoes. That sequence is the useful part. People work down a list when they starve, and nobody kills the dog while the horse is still standing. The order of the deposit is the order of the collapse. And lying in that same layer, cut in the same way, were the human remains. Of roughly 240 people inside that fort in November, about 60 were alive by spring. Powhatan had laid siege. Nobody could hunt. Nobody could fish. Nobody could leave. And in that same layer, mixed in with the animals, were the pieces of a girl. The archaeologist William Kelso found human teeth scattered among the butchered horse and dog bone, then half a skull, then the fragments, then the tibia. The cellar itself matters. It was an L-shaped cellar, and the colonists had used it as a kitchen. At some point it stopped being a kitchen and became a hole to throw things into. Broken pottery went in, including pieces of a German stoneware jug, a Bartman, the kind with a bearded face molded onto the neck. Then the animal bone. Then the fill was capped. A capping is the reason any of this is readable. A sealed deposit is a closed box. Nothing later worked its way down into it, and nothing from it drifted up. Everything in that layer went in during the same short window, and the pottery and the animal bone both date that window to the starving time. So this is not a scatter of bones somebody found in a field. It is a sealed context with a date on it. The remains went to Dr. Douglas Owsley at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. Owsley had been reading Jamestown's dead for 20 years by then. His team had already worked out that one skeleton from the fort had been shot in the leg, that another was a young boy struck by an arrow in 1607, that a third was almost certainly Captain Bartholomew Gosnold, one of the men who planned the colony in the first place. He knew this ground. He knew what its bones normally look like. These did not look like that. And then the bone was asked 4 questions. Asterisk, question 1. Who was this? Asterisk, not a name. Bone does not give you names, but it gives you an age, and it gives it precisely. Third molars, wisdom teeth that had not yet erupted, with roots still incomplete, a growth plate still open at the knee. Those 2 things together narrow it down hard. She was 14, not approximately 14. 14. 14. Where did she come from? Asterisk. This is where the science stops being about the body and starts being about water. Isotopes are versions of the same element with slightly different weights. The ratios in your food and your drinking water get locked into your bone and teeth as they form, and different regions of the world have different signatures. It works like a chemical postmark stamped into you as a child. Hers pointed to southern England, but there is a second reading, and it is the one that tells you who she actually was in that fort. They looked for lead. Wealthy English households ate and drank from pewter. Pewter contains lead, and lead accumulates in bone. If you grew up eating off pewter, your skeleton says so for the rest of time. Her bones showed no meaningful lead signature. She ate off wood. That single absence places her socially. She was not one of the gentlemen. She was working class. She may have arrived in August 1609 in a group that included a handful of women, the sort of settlers George Percy sneered at as unruly gallants, and John Smith complained were more fit to spoil a commonwealth than to build one. She had been in Virginia for a matter of months, and there is one more thing the chemistry does, which is quietly devastating. Isotopes record diet as well as geography. They can show roughly how much animal protein a person was getting while their tissue was forming. Hers records the food of her childhood in England, the years before she boarded a ship. That means the chemistry in her bone belongs to a girl who was eating normally. Poorly, but normally. Bread, some meat, whatever a working household in southern England put on a wooden plate. The starvation that killed her happened too fast to leave a chemical trace. She was in Virginia for a few months, and it took everything. Asterisk 3. What happened to the bone after she died? Asterisk. Owsley's report is clinical, and the clinical language is what makes it land. Multiple chops and cuts from 3 different sharp metal implements, something like a knife, and a cleaver or a small hatchet. 4 chops to the middle of the forehead, then a series of deep chops to the back of the head, forceful enough that the cranium fractured along its midline. The pattern, in his words, reflects a concerted effort to remove soft tissue in the brain. The shin bone shows the same thing. Cut for meat. And here is the detail I keep coming back to. Those 4 blows to the forehead did not work. Owsley describes them as tentative, a failed attempt to open the cranium. Only after they failed did the body get turned over and the back of the skull opened instead. Think about what that means about the person holding the blade. They did not know how to do this. There was no technique. 4 hesitant strikes to the front, no result, then a change of approach. Butchers know where to cut. This was somebody who had never done it before and was working it out on the spot. That is not a ritual. That is not a practice with rules behind it. That is the hardest kind of evidence to argue with, because you cannot fake hesitation. Asterisk question 4. What does she look like? Asterisk. The skull came in as more than a dozen fragments. Reassembling that physically means glue, and glue means guessing, and guessing means damage. So they did not touch it. The pieces went into a CT scanner. The fragments were fitted back together as a virtual model on screen, where a wrong move cost nothing. That digital skull was then sent to be printed as a 3-dimensional physical replica. The face was built onto the replica using tissue depth standards. Nobody had to break the evidence to see her. The bone stayed in pieces in a tray, and the girl came back as a face. 14 years old. English. Poor. 4 months in Virginia. Now the objection, and it is a serious one, from a serious historian. Rachel Herman has pushed back on the certainty around this. Her argument is not that the cut marks are imaginary. They are there. Her argument is about what the cut marks are for. Consider the alternative. If Jane was the wife in those documents, she may have been killed and dismembered so her husband could take her share of the stored food, and the mutilation of the corpse may have been done to make her hard to identify, not to eat her. Same marks, completely different act. And she is right that there is no way to connect a specific girl to that specific story in those documents. That link does not exist. It has been assumed. Note also what the bone cannot say. There are no signs of murder on these remains. That does not mean she was not killed. Strangulation leaves nothing on bone. It means the skeleton is silent on the question of how she died, and the argument has been running ahead of the evidence. I think the strongest position is narrower than the headlines were. What the bone proves is that a human body was butchered inside James Fort during that winter, in the same lair and in the same manner as the animals they were eating. Whether this particular girl is the wife in Percy's account is unproven and probably unprovable. Kelsa's own summary is the honest one. Archaeology, forensic science, and the historical record together, he argues, make the case incontrovertible, not the skull alone, the three together. So, come back to the founding story. The version most Americans were taught runs on hardship and endurance. A difficult winter, brave settlers, Pocahontas, John Smith, survival nation. The Virginia Company built that version deliberately, in print, while the fort was still standing. And that is the part that should sit with you. Not the cannibalism, the editing. For 400 years, the printed word won. The accounts of that winter were treated as slander, exactly as the company had framed them. Then somebody dug out a cellar, and the ground handed over a 14-year-old girl in a layer of butchered horsebone, and the document lost. Bone has no investors. And this is still an open excavation, in the sense that matters. About 180 people died inside that fort in a single winter. One set of remains has been recovered showing this. 1. Where the rest of them went is not known. Some were buried. Some are presumably still under that ground. Some may be in the river. The fort's own burials from that winter were rushed, shallow and unmarked, because the living were too weak to dig properly. And there is a reason nobody can simply go and check. Jamestown is not an empty field. It is a national historic site with a shoreline that the James River has been eating for 4 centuries. Part of the original fort is already gone into the water. Excavation there is slow, licensed, and deliberately incomplete. Archaeologists leave ground untouched on purpose so that future methods can read what current methods would destroy. Which means the honest answer to what else is down there is that we have chosen not to know yet. And the second question nobody can answer. Jane was one body in one cellar. Was this a single act by a single desperate person, or was it happening across the fort that winter in rooms nobody has excavated yet? There is not enough evidence to say there may never be. The pieces are still pieces. The skull was never glued back together, because the scanner made that unnecessary, and the fragments are worth more intact as fragments. They sit in a case at Jamestown, beside the printed face of a girl whose name nobody knows, on the site of the fort that ate her. For 400 years she was a rumor that powerful men had paid to have called a lie. Then a shovel went through the floor of a kitchen cellar. The document said it never happened. The dirt disagreed.